Second identity on becoming an Anglo-American. Who are you indeed? Who would talk or sing? Who are you indeed? Who would talk or sing to America? We go to Europe to be Americanized. The American who has known Europe much can never again see his country with the single eye of his anti-European days. It did not cause me any trouble to become an Italian, but my becoming an American is my own work. It doesn't happen to me anymore, because a fresh generation of Africans and Asians has arisen to take over the business, but in my early years in Washington, D.C., I would often find myself in the back of a big, beat-up old cab driven by an African-American veteran. I became used to the formalities of the mise-en-scene. On some hot and drowsy Dixie-like afternoon, I would flag down a flaking Chevy. Behind the wheel, leaning way back and relaxed, often with a cigar stub in the corner of his mouth, and I am not making this up, but sometimes also with a genuine pork pie hat on the back of his head, would be a grizzled man with the waist of his pants somewhere up around his armpits. I would state my desired destination in accordance with ancient cab driver custom. He would say nothing in response, but simply engage the stick shift on his steering wheel and begin to cruise in a leisurely fashion. There would be a pause, then. "You from England?" I would always try to say something along the lines of, "Well, I'm in no position to deny it." This occasionally got me a grin. In any case, I always knew what was coming next. "I was there once. Were you in the service?" "I sure was." "Did you get to Normandy?" "Yes, sir," but it wasn't Normandy or combat about which they wanted to reminisce. With real combat veterans, by the way, it almost never is. It was England itself. Man, did it know how to reign, and the warm beer. Nice people, though, real nice. I would never forget to say, as I got out and deliberately didn't overtip, that seeming a cheap thing to do, how much this effort on their part was remembered and appreciated. It is not at that level that the Anglo-American special relationship is usually celebrated. It tends to be more consecrated by meetings of the Churchill Society, by the Queen's visit to horseflesh haciendas in Virginia and Kentucky, by ceremonies with flags and drums and national banners. But I think that the above element of it deserves to be better remembered. For many of these brave gentlemen, segregated in their U.S. Army units, England was the first picture they ever saw of how a non-segregated society might look. In my hometown of Portsmouth, there was a riot in 1943, with the locals scorning attempts by American military policemen to enforce a color bar in the pubs. The young Medgar Evers apparently told his English friends that after what he had seen and learned, when he got back to Mississippi, he wasn't going to put up with any more of this garbage. On my very first trip through the Deep South in 1970, I stopped at some tiny Greyhound bus way station in Alabama to have a glass of refreshment, and a young black man, hearing my voice, came up to be hospitable and said, "We here greatly admire the stand of you all in the Second World War." It stuck in my mind because it was the first time I had ever actually heard someone say y'all. It seemed to take slightly longer to say in this part of Alabama, and because I could be fairly sure that on this occasion it must actually mean all of us rather than just the person being addressed, I now appreciate the difference between y'all and all of y'all. Americans. They came right out with things. Hitchens' family lore related the tale of how once, when I was but a toddler, my parents were passing with me through an airport and ran into some Yanks. "Real cute kids," said these big brash people without troubling to make a formal introduction. They insisted on photographing me before breaking off to resume their American lives. Pressed into my dimpled fist, a signed dollar bill in token of my cuteness. This story was often told. I expect that Yvonne and the commander had been to an airport together perhaps 3 times in their lives, and always with a note of condescension. That was Americans for you, wanting to be friendly all right, but so loud and inclined to flash the cash. Parental views diverged a bit at this point, precisely because of the same wartime memory that the old grunts in D.C. had been recalling. The commander tended to stress the deplorable tardiness of the American entry into the Second World War, and the exorbitant price exacted Mr. Roosevelt for the superannuated ships he had offered to Britain under his Lend-Lease program. Yvonne's memory of the same conflict was more indulgent. American servicemen in wartime Britain were open-handed and warm, and to a date could bring along things like nylon stockings and chocolate and smoked salmon. Those very factors helped explain the gender differences in attitudes to Yanks. British fighters drew much smaller wages and had scant access to frills and luxuries. It wasn't very long before our guests and deliverers from across the Atlantic were being sourly described as overpaid, oversexed, and over here. Though it was generally agreed, as George Orwell noted at the time, that the black or Negro soldiers were the most courteous and gallant among them. So I was brought up at home and at school with an ambivalent view of our American cousins. Like many poor relations, we consoled ourselves Englishly with the thought that we made up in good taste and refinement for what we increasingly lacked in money and influence. Americanism, in all its forms, seemed to be trashy and wasteful and crude, even brutal. There was a metaphor ready to hand in my native Hampshire. Until some time after the war, the Squirrels of England had been read. I can still vaguely remember these sweet Bowtree Potter-type creatures, smaller and prettier and more agile, and lacking the rat-like features that disclose themselves when you get close to a gray squirrel. These latter riffraff, once imported from America by some kind of regrettable accident, had escaped from captivity and gradually massacred and driven out the more demure and refined English breed. It was said that the gray squirrels didn't fight fair, and would, with a ranking motion of their back paws, castrate the luckless red ones. Whatever the truth of that, the sighting of a native English squirrel was soon to be a rarity, confined to the north of Scotland and the Isle of Wight. And this seemed to be emblematic for the anxious lower middle class, of a more general massification and degentrification, and, well, Americanization of everything.